Hello, there's about 20 minutes of video here, and it's an introduction to planning as one of the functionalities of management. I must point out that we're not going to talk about planning initially because we have, first of all, to talk about decision making, because planning is nothing other than making decisions about one's intentions for the future. And while planning requires intention, it is the case that you need to make decisions about those intentions. So let me share a presentation with you, and that'll guide me through what it is I wish to cover with you. With the screen shared and now having retreated to the corner of your screen, I'm going to tell you, first of all, that we have to work to an agenda, and the agenda is the learning points that you have on your Learn 2023 page, your Moodle page. Step one is to say, what is decision making? Because that's about definitions and principles, about setting the parameters for the discussion. The second thing is to distinguish between types of decisions. In this case, programmed and non-programmed decisions. I'm going to give you a bit of a heads up here and say that in the second part of the lesson, I'm going to suggest that there are also categories of decision. So I would like you to think perhaps of programmed and non-programmed decisions as classes in some sort of tiered ontology, although that's going to be something which is not necessary for this level 1 module. We'll learn about ontology in your level 3 modules and beyond. Then we're going to say, what are the steps of decision making? Because that's a process, and it'll be very, very nice, particularly if we were to define decision making in the first learning objective as a process. Then we could, in objective 3, say, well, if it is a process, and yes, I can tell you it is a process, what are the steps of that process? Then we'll contemplate, as the close or the conclusion of this video lesson, whether it's better to take decisions in group form or as an individual manager. The definition given to you by your textbook is one I don't really like. I think it is narrow and incomplete, and that means that I looked for alternatives for you, and from a psychology, the alternative I found was this one. We learn that decision making is a process. It's cognitive, but it's a cognitive process, and that results in the selection of beliefs, courses of action among several alternative options. I'm going to say that the process of selecting a belief or a course of action to follow, you know, as a human being, that our decision making is not always apparently rational. So those poor decisions we make are frequently examples simply of nothing other than failing to take into account the information necessary to establish what satisfactory alternatives are. And we do that because we are biased towards the kind of decisions that we feel good about. It's like needing to be on diet and eating anyway because it makes us feel good. Now, that's the alternative from human sites. And here's the definition from the internet. And it tells me that decision making is a process of making choices. And one does that by pursuing a process which, first of all, identifies a problem and gathers information and then assesses alternative resolutions. One imagines that I could put a comma here and write, and then one takes the decision and implements it. Not so? Right. That's a long one, but it's not a bad one. It says that decision making is about making choices. Great, we've got that now. Among alternative courses of action. Okay, there's that alternatives thing. Should have struck home by this time. And that might include inaction. Oh, that's a new one. We're saying over here that a decision could be doing nothing. It's quite possibly going to be irrational, but sometimes the rational choice is in fact to do nothing, like having an argument with me or your parents or a priest. Is it an argument that You are able to win based upon what you know and the information at your disposal. You know, you argue violently with your parents and older siblings and the like, as they dictate what it is that they believe you should do, and you react to that sometimes not as satisfactorily as you ought. Not so. So the issue as it affects us is just to recognize that the decisions we make are sometimes not so good. And here's the critical thing. I'm now saying, look, there could be as many as 5 bad decisions out of every 10 decisions that you take. And if you're making 5 bad decisions, or decisions which are not effective because they don't achieve the resolution or the outcome that one intended when one undertook the decision, or undertook to make the decision or take the decision. The reality is that managers are always playing catch up, as do you and I, because we manage our own lives, not so. And we're always playing catch up because sometimes our choices are not necessarily effective, as a consequence of which we have to go back and correct that with a further decision. Now, the thing is, of every 10 decisions you ever get to make, if 5 of the last ones you made were poor, and 5 of the present decisions you are going to make are quite conceivably poor, then you realize that you're always on the back foot. The objective then is simply going to be in the field of management to try and improve managerial effectiveness. But we'll devote some more time to this, I think, in the second lesson. So your text authors say that you make decisions in response to opportunities and threats. And that is what I have a contention with, because I believe that we do more than make decisions in response to opportunities and threats. They are straightforward decisions as well that have nothing to do with opportunity and threat. But have a look at what your textbook authors have to say by pausing the screen at this point, because I'm going to move on and say that the problem I have is that sometimes we make decisions just to keep things ticking along. If we are running a business in the retail sector, then the decision we need to make is how many people must we employ in order to keep things ticking along over the holiday season. And do we stock, these are 2 silly examples perhaps, do you stock Elastoplast or Band-Aid in the first aid box, and do you buy someone flowers for their birthday? Because you see, if you buy one person flowers for their birthday, then you've acted prejudicially in respect of the rest if you never buy them flowers for their birthday. The first aid box doesn't care about whether it's Band-Aid or Elastoplast. And most people who have wounds that need a plaster on are not going to worry about the brand of the plaster particularly. They just want not to drip blood out of their finger, for example. The point here is that sometimes decisions are not just about opportunity and threat. They are, however, made by people who have the authority to make them, and we assign that authority in organizations. So we've learned now that there are hierarchies of management, and we have junior managers, middle and senior managers as a general categorization. And you know from the work of Katz back in the 1950s, the last century, that at different levels of that hierarchy, managers will make different types of decisions. The decisions made by the executives at the very top of the organizational hierarchy are going to be about conceptual things. And those conceptual things are about being effective and being successful and being competitive in the next decade. Whereas a junior manager, lower down in the hierarchy, gets to make decisions that have a far shorter time span. And we talk about this in the second lesson as well. But not only do they have a far shorter time span, they're less likely to bring the company to its knees if the decision is not a good one. So we're saying that the importance of the decision is likely to be something aligned with the importance of the position in the hierarchy of the organization. And the more up you go in the organization to the top, to the corner office, the executive suite, the more critical, more complex, and more profound those decisions tend to become. But please just never forget that not all decisions are profound, all right? So if we were to distinguish programmed decisions from non-programmed decisions, then we'd have to say that a programmed decision is probably like a day-to-day decision, and it's going to be routine, not necessarily about opportunities and threats. but routine, like making sure that the first aid box is replenished with headache medicine and with plasters and what have you. The nice thing is that as we practice our craft as managers, as we run businesses, we get to see what works and what doesn't work in particular situations. And that means we can actually create like a manual, like a guideline, a book, a procedures book that says, if A happens, then do B. And if C happens, then do D. That becomes a routinized or procedural framework by which decisions are made in organizations. We can contrast that with non-programmed decisions, and non-programmed decisions are ones that we can't create routines for, because they just arise out of the blue, so to speak. Unexpected or uncertain contexts will give rise to those decisions, and then we have to apply our brains, and not just the procedures book. And our brains means applying our intuition, what our gut tells us. But I'm not sure that those decisions are necessarily always good for business, because there's no basis upon which you can tell that they are spot on when they're made on the spot. Reasoned judgment means that you are thinking more deeply about the decision and the context, and that means that you'd anticipate that perhaps the decision is going to be a good one, but it isn't necessarily the case. So what does one actually do? In practice, this is what one does. One recognizes the need for a decision. You must know what it is that you are deciding about. And if you know what you're deciding about, then you can say, well, what are the alternatives available to us? And having established what the alternatives are, then you can evaluate those alternatives and you can make a choice. And once you've made a choice, you can actually exercise that choice or implement the choice. And then finally, you can gauge whether the decision was a good one or not by evaluating the outcomes that arise from the decision to see if they are in line with the anticipated outcomes that you imagined would be the case when you chose the alternative you implement. The truth is, we don't necessarily agree on this. There's the old school way, and when in this area of education, whenever we talk old school, then we can probably call it classical. But we distinguish the classical from the administrative model. The classical model is something which simply tells you that you prescribe what the decisions should be. It's very adult and very parental and very controlling, because the anticipation is you decide and then it happens. When in practice, and I'm going to say that you can look at this in the textbook, in practice what transpires is that you make less than optimum decisions because of three things, and those three things are bounded rationality, incomplete information, and a thing we call, a little clumsily, satisficing. Bounded rationality is an easy one. Bounded rationality tells you that there are limits to your comprehension of a situation, limits to your understanding of the outcome of a particular decision, and that means that we are cognitively compromised, if you like. Our rationale is compromised, and I'll leave you to look up in a Google search bar what bounded rationality is. Incomplete information is just a bit easier, because we know that incomplete information means we just don't have the stuff at our fingertips. We just don't know what's going to transpire. And satisficing, I'd like you to Google this one as well, because sometimes we just settle. And when you just settle, that's the same as satisficing. You just figure, I haven't got enough time. I don't really know. So I'm going to make something that I think is okay. It's okay enough. And okay enough sometimes is not okay enough. And you find out after the fact when you evaluate what actually transpired. Whether things are going to be okay or enough or not arises as a consequence of the risk and the uncertainty inherent in the nature of the decision making. Any product business, whether it's selling through distributors or direct to consumers, like Apple, for example, and there is an Apple phone which is being used as a a high definition video cam for the construction of this particular lesson. I'm a fan of Apple, and because it's tech that works, it's tech that lends itself to people developing applications to make life easier, to create productivity opportunity for people like me. And the productivity opportunity that Apple decided would be a good idea way back. Here's a picture of a personal digital assistant. That looks like a little bit like an iPad, okay? You'd concede, but it's a first generation prototype type iPad that was invented back in the 1980s. And when it was invented back in the 1980s and introduced in the early 1990s, it flopped. It flunked awfully. Why? Because it was uncertain as to how people would react when they'd only had personal computers from about 1979, and in this country from about 1981. So it bombed really badly, and things don't turn out as we would like, and they don't seem to be what we hope them to be, because they're ambiguous. And this is an old favorite used in the field of psychology to demonstrate that there are, in respect of visual perception, two alternatives that arise over here. See if you can see the young man or the young woman or the old woman, because that's nothing to do with management, but it does have to do with our perception. We interpret things, we fill in the blanks. That's what psychology lets us know. We fill in the blanks in order to create something which seems whole. And in the presence of ambiguity, that can sometimes be false and lead us to the wrong decision. So, two more things over here, and that is the notion of time constraints and satisficing. It gets really busy when you're a manager, and you're only making 5 good decisions out of every 10. It gets really busy, and sometimes you just have to take a bit of a flyer, a chance, and say, you know what, this seems to be okay. So it might not be ideal, but it'll be okay. And when we decide that things will be okay, and we fail to contemplate how to evaluate our decisions, in other words, by setting any criteria, we sometimes make decisions which are not as productive or as effective as we would like. I'm going to suggest to you that when we make a decision, what we should be doing, I beg your pardon, what we should be doing is making a decision which is feasible in the first instance, and in the second instance is something which is feasible economically. In other words, we can afford it. You might need a vehicle, and that means a practical decision would be to buy a car, but it might not be a practical decision to buy an unaffordable car, you recognize. And then we have to give thought to the fact that maybe buying a terribly expensive car is not necessarily an ethical exercise, even if it is a legal one, depending on what one does. The kind of evaluation we have to undertake of the decisions we make is a very simple and straightforward procedure, though. We simply say, what is it that we thought would happen, and what actually happened? Then we can try and work out why that was. And if we do so, we'll probably have guidelines for what we can do better in the future. Making the decisions, however, is something which we can choose to do either as individuals, or we can choose to do it in groups. And there is this thought process that says that making decisions in groups is the best thing to do, simply because a group is less likely to fall victim to the bias that an individual does. And because there's lots of people, you can rely on the combined skills of everyone in the group, because they'll probably generate you more alternatives and more feasible alternatives to that. And I'm going to say I don't necessarily support that, because the evidence in many organizations suggests that groups, first of all, can take a very long time to make a decision compared to an individual, and it can be rife with disagreement and also the bias that individuals display. And there is the case that weak group members can simply be along for the ride. And finally, and this is the biggie, a thing we call groupthink. And groupthink occurs when the group members adopt the position of the group leader. And that's in business, as an applied business management reality, better for their careers than not doing so, depending on how autocratic the system of management is in the particular enterprise or context. But that group influence, that notion of there being like an in crowd and an out crowd, is something which is absolutely rank and reprehensible in organizations, no matter whether they are commercial or public or academic, for example. There are frightful examples in all of those. And to arrive at a decision at the expense of what would be a better outcome is, I think, a treachery. So faulty and biased decision making and a repugnance for conflict doesn't give rise to good decision making, and that is something that we can't really afford to practice as a mentality, because it really doesn't serve us well. At this point in time, I think I need to leave it there and have you prepare yourself for the next lesson.